the first time in my channel's history, we have a new Bond film. So today I'm going to stop and rank all 25 canon James Bond films from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of all 25 Bond films. My list isn't the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to see yours. One more thing before we get started. This video is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook of your choice by signing up for a free 30-day trial of Audible at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. I've been a massive Audible fan for about 6 years now, and I wish I'd signed up for Audible 5 years before that. If you're watching this video, you're obviously a Bond fan, and you can get Casino Royale or any other Ian Fleming Bond novel for free by signing up for a free trial at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. If you're like me, you like to read with your ears, not your eyes, and Audible is the way that I do it. Get your free Bond book or any other book in their library for free by signing up for a free trial at that link down below in the description. And let's get started. In last place, Octopussy, a Bond film where it feels like there's a competition between the film itself and Roger Moore to see which one will look older and more played out. At this point in time, Roger Moore's age is too apparent. And there's a bunch of interesting things you can do with the concept of an aging, womanizing spy, but the movie doesn't explore any of them. It just plays it just like he's this suave 40-year-old, and he's simply not anymore. Instead of an interesting story about an aging spy, we get a spy movie set at a circus with an awful lot of clowns. There's a sequence where Bond swings from a vine and it does the Tarzan swing. This legitimately comes off as self-parody most of the time. In the finale, Bond basically bear hugs the exterior of a plane while it's in flight. So for me, there's just simply nothing here that I enjoyed and a whole lot of stuff that I rolled my eyes at. Number 24, Diamonds Are Forever. After taking a one-movie break, Connery returns for another film, and he simply looks much older, and the franchise feels tired.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Now, the introduction has Bond out for revenge after the events of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is a great setup for a Bond film, but unfortunately, the movie plays out that entire plot line before the opening credit sequence, and then Bond moves on with his life with no emotional repercussions, and we go off on just a totally generic Bond adventure involving diamonds and Blofeld faking his death. And normally the franchise is known for going off to these exotic, beautiful locations. This movie, they go to LA and Las Vegas, which by comparison just come off trashy in this movie. There's something nice about seeing Connery in the role again in a canon Bond film. The gimmick of that wears off very quickly, and you just get a very bland Bond film. Number 23, A View to a Kill. Roger Moore's final outing as Bond, unfortunately, is one of his worst. The problem is everything simply feels played out. The cold open is once again Roger Moore doing a ski chase sequence, which we've seen him do before, and the way they try and make it fresh and new is by having the Beach Boys' California Girls playing underneath it. And then at the end of the sequence, Bond hooks up with a girl who's literally 30 years younger than him, which comes off much creepier than it does suave.
Not a great plan.
The thing that kind of does elevate this one just a little bit is the supporting cast. Of course, you have Christopher Walken as the main villain, but you also have Grace Jones, Dolph Lundgren, Alison Doody, just several of these familiar 80s faces. It's nice to see them thrown into the mix. The final action sequence on the Golden Gate Bridge is some nice iconic imagery, but all throughout the film, it all feels familiar, and the franchise needed a restart and a new Bond at this point in time. Next up, Die Another Day, an incredibly frustrating Bond film because the basic setup here is quite good. The execution of the movie quite bad. But the movie starts off with this idea of what if Bond was captured, tortured for over a year, and then when he's freed, MI6 doesn't trust him? That's a great setup for a James Bond movie, but all of the potential storylines they could have gone with, instead, it just immediately turns into another generic Bond film. But the biggest issue here is that tonally, it's all over the place. This is never more obvious than in the opening credit sequence where Bond is literally being tortured and drowned and electrocuted while a catchy, upbeat Madonna song is playing on top of it. Likewise, while the basic setup of the movie involves Bond being tortured for a year, this film contains some of the most cartoonish sequences in the entire franchise, in particular where Bond is escaping an ice castle while being chased by a laser being shot from the sky, and then finds himself parasurfing down a tsunami, avoiding glaciers in one of those ridiculous sequences I've ever seen in a movie, with some of the worst visual effects I've seen in a blockbuster in the 21st century.
Wow, that was weird.
Unfortunately, despite the movie having a few good ideas, Brosnan's tenure as Bond ended on a whimper that was frequently embarrassing rather than a bang. Coming in at number 21, the man with the golden gun. Roger Moore's second outing as Bond cranks up the goofiness, but fails to deliver a compelling story. Now, this is one that I really wanted to have a little bit higher up on the list because it's simply fun to see Christopher Lee as a Bond villain. The basic idea of Bond as this assassin trying to stop a worse assassin that's a villain, that's an interesting idea for a film, but unfortunately this one is just bogged down by a script that has too many plot lines going on at the same time, since there's something going on about trying to harness the power of the sun, but the main plot line is actually about these two assassins trying to stop each other. Likewise, the humor and goofiness just gets a little bit out of hand here. Like, there's simply no way to justify bringing back the hillbilly cop in this film. So while there's some fun novelty to seeing Bond battling Count Dooku in an actual duel at the end of the film, overall, a pretty bad Bond flick. Bringing us into the top 20, Live and Let Die. Moore's first Bond film is not my favorite of his run. Now, certainly, him in the lead brings some much needed new energy to the franchise, but the plot of the film, in particular the actions of Bond, just did not sit right with me. In particular, there's a plot point where Bond tricks a young religious zealot into sleeping with him, where he takes her virginity, and she's literally less than half of his age. Ew. Bond has done some questionable womanizing things in these movies. I think this is by far the creepiest version of Bond. From there's a lot of like racial elements in the film that are so tied to the early 70s that it's kind of uncomfortable to watch at this point in time. And then in the finale, there's a pretty cool little boat chase sequence where they're jumping speedboats through this marsh. That's cool. Goes on a little bit too long. And then there's this hillbilly sheriff all throughout the entire thing that it's like the director thought was super funny and just included him way too much in the film. And so for me, there's a couple things that they're kind of nice about it. Love the Paul McCartney theme song, but the actions of Bond, the weird racial stuff, and the hillbilly cop, didn't dig it at all. Number 19, The World Is Not Enough. A Bond film with a central idea that's pretty good, but just got lost somewhere in the execution. It starts off with this great cold open involving a speedboat chase and a hot air balloon, and just from there, it falls flat. Like, the idea of a Bond villain who has Stockholm Syndrome should be this really interesting film and just a different take on how to do a villain scheme in one of these movies. But I think a lot of the casting doesn't work. In particular, Denise Richards is just horribly miscast as a nuclear physicist or whatever she is, and she doesn't look the part. She's dressed like Lara Croft Tomb Raider, and there's just no believability of her in that particular role. Likewise, I don't think Robert Carlyle's the right person to play the other villain in the film, and most of the action sequences are just pretty forgettable besides the cold open. And so while there's some ideas here that I think work, the end result, the way it's all put together, didn't really resonate. Then we have Thunderball. After a solid initial set of films, for me, this was the first step backwards for the franchise. Now, the action sequences are getting bigger and more memorable, where you have Bond with a jetpack, underwater fight sequences, and big boat battles. But when it comes to the actual plot itself about the spa, I just didn't find it all that compelling or feel the sense of urgency or danger as I was watching it. And some of the campier, goofier elements start to creep in just a little bit, where you have like Bond being strapped to a massage table as a way that they're trying to kill him at one point in time. And so while it follows the formula of Goldfinger, it doesn't deliver nearly as much excitement. And so for me, I know this comes from a classic era of Bond films, but this one didn't connect with me all that well. Number 17, Moonraker, possibly the most ridiculous of the Bond films. But for me, I thought it was campy fun. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It's certainly ridiculous and falls into the category of self-parody very frequently, but it's totally consistent with itself as it's doing all of this. It's low-hanging fruit, it's schlocky fun, but it is a lot of fun. And there's a bunch of memorable things that happen, in particular involving Jaws chasing Bond. And so you have a chase as they're skydiving. You have the SkyTrain fight sequence. Of course, they go into space at the end of it. There's just a lot of things like that that are ridiculous. It's cheap entertainment, but I did find it entertaining. That brings us to Quantum of Solace, a Bond film that was better than I remembered it being, but it's still a movie that has a lot of script issues, and it feels like the story is in competition with itself. Now, the basic setup of the movie of Bond out for revenge and emotionally compromised after the events of Casino Royale is a great setup for a Bond film, but then it's connected to this plot line about the villain, Green, whose scheme is to price gouge the cost of drinking water, and the movie just never does a good enough job explaining why Green will be an emotionally satisfying villain as the conclusion to the revenge plot. Adding to that, it feels like the action in this movie was heavily influenced by the style of the Bourne films, which had been massive hits over the previous few years, by doing these action sequences that were shot in close-up, handheld, shaky camera, and edited with a bunch of quick cuts. And it's just a bad way to shoot action. It's well documented that this movie was one of the victims of the writer's strike of the late zeros, where basically the actual screenwriters wrote all the way up until midnight one night when a writer's strike happened, and then the director and Craig had to do their best with what they had, and Craig himself had to do some last-minute rewrites on the set to just try and complete the film. It's slick, it's watchable, but it fails to live up to the ambition of being a satisfying direct follow-up to Casino Royale. Number 15, Spectre, a frustrating mix of good and bad ideas that simply runs on too long. The big hook here is that the movie provides basically the background that ties together all of the Bond films. But there's this delicate balance between having this interesting connective tissue for your franchise and then making a bunch of choices that just make your universe feel small. And this movie crosses the line into just making the universe feel small by having everyone have a close personal connection to everyone else. The biggest violation here is having Bond and Blofeld turn out to be basically adopted brothers that grew up together, which is literally a joke plot point from the Bond spoof film Goldmember from 15 years before this movie came out. And it's frustrating because at its core, this idea of this 21st century younger person that views the 00 agency as outdated and thinks that the surveillance state is technology of the future, that's a great plot line and exploration to put in a Bond film, and they do it just a little bit, and they take it a little bit the wrong direction at the same time. So it's frustrating when there's a bunch of things in this movie that are better than people give the movie credit for, and then there's certain things in it that are just as bad as the movie's reputation. Next up, Dr. No. The franchise made its mark from the very beginning. The casting of Connery is some of the most iconic casting in all of cinema history, and all the way back nearly 60 years ago, most of the trademark elements of the personality of Bond were present back then. The suave man of action that's good with the ladies and the one-liners at the same time. Connery nailed all of it right out of the gate with the very first film. Likewise, they established this musical theme for the franchise that's lasted almost 60 years, and they're still using it every single film. And so many things that are trademarks, quintessential Bond, are right there in the very first film.
Bond. James Bond.
Now, while certain things are pretty much the same, others have changed quite a bit. I mean, this movie feels quaint compared to the later Connery films, let alone when compared to the $200+ million spectacle blockbusters the franchise has turned into. It actually makes it tough to do a ranking like this because action in cinema has changed so dramatically over the last 59 years. But despite it not being perfect Bond films, the right things were right, and they laid the foundation for the longest running film franchise in cinema history. Number 13, You Only Live Twice. This is peak campy Connery, and I was totally down for all of it. It manages to be campy and over the top without being fully goofy. It's totally consistent with itself. Then you got Loomis from the Halloween franchise playing this cartoon version of Blofeld that fits the over-the-top nature of this film, but it also set the stage for decades worth of parodies of the character.
I shall look forward personally to exterminating you, Mr. Bond.
And when Mr. Bigglesworth gets upset, people die!
Maybe it's cheap entertainment, but it's my type of cheap entertainment. I just love all the martial arts and ninja stuff, people being kidnapped in space, the big gigantic battle at the secret evil lair. Yeah, it's silly, but it's a lot of fun. Add to that, I thought that the score kind of had a nice romantic vibe to it. And fun fact, Roald Dahl, the famous family author, wrote the script for the film. Then we have For Your Eyes Only, Roger Moore's second best outing as Bond, and I think that's simply because it's a movie that's a little bit more human and emotional. It kicks off with Bond visiting the grave of his dead wife, and then it gets swept away on this kind of wacky sequence where a non-identified Blofeld is trying to kill him, and it leads to Bond dropping him into like a nuclear silo. So that's the goofiness of the Moore era films, but it portrays Bond as a more vicious character. There's like a sequence in the movie that's my favorite moment from Roger Moore where he literally kicks a car off the side of a building to kill off this henchman that you just kind of despise by that point in time in the movie. The main Bond girl is out for revenge because her parents were killed. And so it just has kind of that viciousness to it, while still having the fun of this era Bond films. And even some of the action starts to have some real tension in it. In particular, as they're trying to like climb into the secret base at the end, and the way some of the stuff is going on with the ropes and everything. Add to that, it's got this super 70s funky disco take on the Bond theme from Bill Conti that's just a nice little touch. Well, the Roger Moore era of Bond films are far from my favorite. There are a couple of solid ones in there. Number 11, The Living Daylights, a much needed reset for the franchise and the character. For me, Timothy Dalton is a huge upgrade as the leading man over Roger Moore. He plays the character much more straightforward, less cheeky, and just the nature of the action, like there's a great final sequence in it where they're dangling from the back of a plane on a cargo net that just feel like big 80s action sequences. Thought the plot itself was a little bit scattershot about this defector that's not a real defector, and then this assassin that doesn't want to be an assassin, and then suddenly we're in Afghanistan. There's a few things about it that I thought needed to be focused a little bit better, and even the main conflict involving Russia and Afghanistan feels very late 80s. But in general, a much needed refresh for the franchise in terms of its aesthetics, its storytelling, and in particular, its leading man. Kicking off our top 10 on Her Majesty's Secret Service, perhaps the most unusual film on this list, because it has a one-off Bond in George Lazenby in a film where Bond decides to settle down and get married.
One of these things is not like the other.
But even beyond Lazenby, stylistically, it feels and looks different from the other Bond films of this era. There's a lot more close-ups. When it comes to the action, the sound effects are more exaggerated. There's a lot more editing. The staging is more dramatic and exciting and dynamic in the way that it plays out. The story features a Bond that forms attachments to the people around him, where he really cares about someone. Blofeld has a lot of little nuances to his characterization and his scheme, and even the little way that he's holding his cigarette stands out and is kind of interesting. And so it feels like a Bond film that was ahead of its time in what it was trying to do with the character and the storytelling, and have Bond actually grow and change throughout the film, which is something that didn't really happen a whole lot during this era. So it might be a little bit of an odd one amongst all the Bond films, but that doesn't mean it's not a good one. Number 9, The Spy Who Loved Me. My favorite of the Roger Moore Bond films for a number of reasons. First off, I just felt that it had a more clear plot line than some of the other early Bond films, but you just know what you're working towards. Likewise, very early on, they establish the dynamic of the relationship between Bond and the woman, where he's the person that killed the person that she loved, and even though they're allies on this mission, she swears that she's going to kill him once they complete it. And it just makes for an interesting dynamic between Bond and the Bond girl, where you actually care about the choices he makes, because when he rescues her, he doesn't know if afterwards she's going to turn on him and kill him. That's an interesting plot to put in a movie like this. And then just beyond that, I think it's a more well-rounded version of Roger Moore's version of Bond. He gets his one-liners and his dad jokes, but he's also a more vicious version of the character that questions a guy on the edge of a building and then drops him off. At the end, he puts 4 bullets in the main bad guy. Jaws is just a fun henchman, but it's not fully cartoonish like it was in Moonraker. So once again, not a big gigantic fan of Roger Moore's tenure as Bond, but this is a good film. Next up, Tomorrow Never Dies. From the director of comedy classic Stop or My Mom Will Shoot, we get Brosnan's second outing as James Bond, and I have always enjoyed this film. A big gigantic part of that is at the point in time this movie came out, I was huge into Hong Kong cinema, and one of our Bond girls is Michelle Yeoh, who had previously been in Super Cop, so I was so excited when she was announced as the Bond girl for this film. And I think this is the one example of where the Bond girl has a more impressive action movie resume than the Bond actor himself. Add to that, it has a plotline that at the time felt a little bit goofy about this news corporation that wants to manufacture the news for personal gain, that in light of the last 20 plus years feels almost a little bit ahead of its time because of what the news media has kind of turned into. Kicks off with a great cold open with some nice urgency of Bond having to save the day before these missiles hit. And actually back in the day, I watched this one more than I watched Goldeneye. So I don't think it's necessarily top tier Bond, but it's very enjoyable Bond. Number 7, From Russia with Love. If Dr. No was the movie that laid the foundation, if it was the rough draft for the franchise, this is where things start getting built on that foundation where you start getting a much more polished draft of what a Bond movie can be. You get even more of the Bond trademarks with actual opening credits sequence. But beyond that, clearly they had a much bigger budget. The action is much more extravagant here, and the storytelling much more nuanced in the way that it handles the espionage elements with this woman that's being manipulated into being a spy, and the two of them are kind of working one another. Even as you kind of have the sequence with Bond being captured by the enemy henchmen on the train, has this tension in it where each of them knows the other one is trying to work them, and you have to have this Bond who's trying to outmaneuver this other person. And so you have a movie that certainly is the franchise in its early phases, but it still manages to have iconic action sequences such as the famous final speedboat action sequence at the end with the flare gun and the exploding barrels. You have the espionage that ran all throughout the entire franchise, and a solid entry very early on in the franchise. Then we have License to Kill. This movie and Goldeneye were essentially my introduction to the franchise as someone that just loves 80s action movies, revenge thrillers. This is the Bond equivalent of that. And I think it also just helps the movie in general that in the first 15 minutes, it establishes the characters, their connections to one another, and who Bond is out to get. We care about the mission because we care about Bond and his connection to these other people. Beyond that, it might be the most violent Bond film. Gone are the lasers. People are just getting fed to sharks, and not even sharks with freaking lasers on their heads.
You know, I have one simple request, and that is to have sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their heads.
But you have a guy being depressurized to the point that he explodes. Benicio del Toro gets fed into a grinder and it literally shows his bloody pulp shooting at the screen. Couple other nice touches, the final chase at the end with the semi-truck and the tilting on its side to avoid a missile. Classic Bond stuff. And I love that Q got more involved in this movie than he traditionally does. So for me, it's a little bit of a different sort of film for the franchise because it is so much of a straightforward revenge film, but that's exactly why I like it so much. In fifth place, Goldfinger. This is the classic era of Bond films coming into their own with the gadgets, the quips, the action. All of it just feels like the creative team at the beginning of this franchise in their prime. And a lot of that is that the movie simply feels much more cinematic than the first two entries. What I mean by that, with Dr. No, some of the action felt very stage-like with the camera only pointing in one direction, long takes, simple action setups. Here, right out of the gate, even with the bomb sequence, the way it's edited, the way it's cut, feels cinematic. Then you have a fight sequence where Bond looks at the person in front of him and it shows the reflection in their eye as part of the choreography. That's a trick you can't do with a play. It's cinematic in nature inherently. But from there, you just get all the Bond trademarks of the humor and the kind of slightly cartoonish technology. This is peak Connery with the quips and the humor.
Shocking.
Well, congratulations on your promotion, Goldfinger.
Even the score here is great. This is where the franchise was still new enough that it was fresh and new, but they'd worked out enough of the kinks and built on the foundation and provided the best Bond of this era. In fourth place, Goldeneye. Pierce Brosnan's first take at the character is one of the best in the franchise for a number of different reasons. Right off the bat, I feel like the Pierce Brosnan era is a better version of what they were going for with Roger Moore. He can be cheeky and funny and do the one-liners, but he's a lot more believable as both the womanizer as well as he has a better sneer. He feels more dangerous and you can see the anger inside of him at certain points in time. Also, as an action movie, it's just jam-packed with memorable sequences. It kicks off with this great cold open where he's running down the dam. You have the tank chase. You have the finale where they're at that big gigantic satellite. They stand out in your memory. And then even beyond that, it takes Bond on this journey where he does have personal connections to the villain in a way that's meaningful. Another nice touch here is it just has a fantastic supporting cast. Famke Jensen is on atop, one of the just standout evil Bond girls out there. And then even like Alan Cumming as this sleazy programmer guy that screams, "I am invincible!"
Yes, I am invincible.
It pops so much more than it probably should, and so much of that is the direction from Martin Campbell that just, he knows how to elevate all of it, have well-rounded characters, and build tension in sequences, like the sequence where they're spinning the pin around and they've established the rules so the audience knows the danger that's taking place. Or it could be Bond's way to escape. So in general, it's got great action, it's got a great Bond, and it's just a well-rounded film. Real quick before I give you my top 3, remember to join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of all 25 canon Bond films. My list isn't the right list. It's just my list, and I would love to see yours. Also, if you want more content like this, check out this playlist right up here, where I've done more in-depth, deep dive discussions about the Bond films, as well as a ranking of the Austin Powers movies. And also remember, you can get that free audiobook of any of the Bond films or any audiobook that you want by going to audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler and signing up for a free trial of Audible. In third place, Skyfall. The 50th anniversary Bond film is easily one of the best by going against the formula. The villain scheme is intentionally small in scale and personal. His mission is to take out M. M has made some bad choices and her job is on the line. She got Bond injured. In the film, Bond, instead of being portrayed as the ultimate unstoppable male, is portrayed as a great spy who's past his prime and injured. As you go throughout the journey itself, we learn more about his backstory than we've ever learned before. We spend more time with his relationship with M and the dynamic between the two of them, processing some of their regrets and what's happened in the past. And all of it is absolutely gorgeous. It's one of the best, or probably the best looking Bond films. And while it has awesome action, once again, it's not trying to have the biggest action. It's trying to have good, memorable action. And it's going against the formula that makes this movie stand out, that delivers something new from the 50-year-old franchise. And while it's different, it's definitely something that I'm glad that we got. Our runner-up, No Time to Die. The final Bond film from Daniel Craig is almost certainly going to go down in history as one of the most polarizing, as they went in some bold directions with what they do with the character. And for some people, I totally understand why they feel like this is a betrayal of who the character is. For me, I appreciate this pocket universe version of Bond that is a different characterization, that's more human, that has more flaws, that he's more conflicted in what he wants to do with his life, but it tells a complete story from Casino Royale to this film, and that's what I appreciated, that this movie felt like the logical conclusion of the Bond that they'd been developing over the previous 4 films. And they found a way to give me an emotionally satisfying conclusion to that arc and to that character. Add to that, it simply has some of the absolute best action of the entire franchise. And this is also probably the most emotional Bond film that we've gotten up to this point in time, because it is a Bond who's formed connections. And it's a movie in a world with consequences. When you put those things together, it pulls big emotions out of you. So for me, this is one of the absolute best of the entire franchise. But coming in at number 1, Casino Royale. After going embarrassingly too far into camp with Die Another Day, the producers decided to go with a totally clean slate and start over with a new Bond and a new continuity, as well as a brand new tone. And for my money, it's the best Bond film that we've gotten up to this point in time. Since we're seeing Bond at the beginning of his career as a 00 agent, there's so much room for him to grow, change, and be shaped by the events of the film, and that just makes you care about the character more. Add to that, they throw a Bond girl into the mix that actually makes her mark on him, that makes him become vulnerable, and he actually cares about her by the end of the film. Thus, you care about what happens to her and its effects on him as a character. Likewise, Le Chiffre is just one of these Bond villains that's interesting and intriguing, while just being a guy that for most of the movie is playing cards with Bond. That's kind of the magic of this film, that has a plot line that's card playing heavy, but just as thrilling and edge of your seat as anything else in the franchise. And when the action does happen, it's amazing. Early on in the film, you have this great parkour chase that's probably my favorite action sequence of this entire franchise. So for me, by restarting and going in with a clean slate, they were able to compose this more compelling version of Bond. And Daniel Craig's version is a much more physically intimidating Bond than we've ever had before, that you believe he's an actual brawler, but you also feel the humanity inside of him because they'd allowed him to be vulnerable. And so for me, that makes for the best Bond film that we've ever gotten. So it comes in at number 1. Enjoyed this video? Remember, I've got more like it right over there in that playlist. If you're interested in that free audiobook, the link is down below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.